Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to welcome you today to the webinar, Be the Change, Building Support for Scientist Engagement. This webinar was put together by the UCS Science Network. My name is Adriana Bankston. I'm representing the nonprofit organization Future of Research, and we're very excited to partner with UCS for this webinar, so thank you for that. Our mission is to champion, engage, and empower early career scientists with evidence-based resources to improve the scientific research enterprise. One of the ways that we can improve the research enterprise is to empower scientists to engage with the public and also other stakeholders. However, currently, there are still very few incentives and rewards for scientists to engage in these types of activities, and there's also a very little training for them in this particular area. But recently, there has been more movement for academia to incentivize and reward these types of actions. And the individuals that you'll hear about today, from today are part of this movement. They will discuss strategies for bringing about the changes that they want in the scientific enterprise. And also, they will provide recommendations for others who wish to engage with various stakeholders within their work. So welcome, everyone. I would like to just remind you that if you want to follow the conversation on Twitter, you can use hashtag SciNetWorkshop. And just before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to remind you that you can type in your questions during the talks, and we'll answer them during the second half of the webinar. So I would like to first introduce our first speakers, Nalini, who is a professor of biology at the University of Utah, and Caitlin Weber is a program manager for the STEM Ambassador Program, which is an NSF-funded research and public engagement training program at the University of Utah. They will talk to us about how we can reach out to groups that are typically unengaged with science, and also various other stakeholders in the community.
Hi, this is Nalini. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and Caitlin Weber, our program manager, about the STEM Ambassador Program. Our emphasis for public engagement is on public groups that are currently unengaged with science. Most of the work that is done in public engagement and supported by the National Science Foundation is really for people who are already science engaged. Those who go to zoos or museums or watch National Geographic videos, but our audience, which actually makes up a greater proportion, a greater proportion of the U.S. population are people who are what we might call science unengaged, those who don't see science as part of their daily lives, or those who are not capable physically of getting to science education institutions. We basically followed an ambassador model, just as a foreign service trains and recruits people to go to other countries to understand their culture and bring back information from those countries. We are trying to train scientists to go to the other so-called countries of other societal groups who are not engaged and to bring back information from those groups to academic scientists. Our method that we're currently developing is to first identify appropriate connections, and to provide training workshops, to encourage immersion activities so that our scientists can understand better the culture of the group they're working with, to do prototyping activities, to engage through activities as well, and finally to evaluate the impact on both the scientists and the public audiences. One of the critical steps of this process is actually to identify connections with appropriate public groups. And we do this based on both the research interests of the scientists as well as some of the personal characteristics of the scientist, his or her ethnic group, hobbies, professions, or family relationships. For example, one of our scientists here at the University of Utah carries out research on migratory birds, but he is also a cat owner. And so appropriate audiences for him might be cat owners themselves, or truck drivers who are themselves migratory in some ways, as well as gardeners who might be concerned with birds and cats. The scientists carried out an immersion event to explore the connection with cat owners by visiting a pet store where cat owners are very interested in pets. The message that he conveyed was the effect of cats on birds, and so tried to educate them in that way. I'll give you now some examples of some of our other STEM ambassadors and their engagement. A neuroscientist presented at a senior assisted living center on aspects of the aging brain and neuroscience. One of our microbiologists participated in a fermentation cooking class at a local cooking school that was organized by a local grocery store. A pigeon geneticist, a graduate student whose own mother was a single mom who raised her, encountered a mom's play group and presented her information and research on pigeon genetics. One of our virologists, staff members here, created a coloring book as we realized that the shapes of the molecular shapes of these viruses really lent themselves to the aesthetic sense that would lend themselves to the newly developing interest in coloring. And finally, a mathematician in our mathematics department discussed accompanied a ski trip for charter school youth and discussed friction and ski design on skiing, thereby relating his mathematics to the interests of the group he was encountering. So the lessons learned from all of these interactions are that it's important for the scientists to find common ground and to articulate those common interests to public groups, to define the goals that you want to do, which may not necessarily be learning objectives or science knowledge content, but which might be simply raising awareness of the importance of a particular scientific topic, or the fact that scientists are people too. It's important to get to know the community through immersion events, to tailor messages and materials for them, and of course to be open to learning from them to gain knowledge from these public groups. We have an active website which has many more examples of this, as well as information about our program. And we're very interested in other people connecting with us and participating in the STEM Ambassador Program. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much for this great talk. So let's move on to the second speaker. We have Elyse Aurbach-Pruitt, who is the co-founder and co-director of the Relate program at the University of Michigan. And she will talk to us about how we can work towards institutional support for engaging scientists with the public and also other stakeholders.
Thanks so much, Adriana. I'm thrilled to be here, and I really appreciate y'all having me. I was asked to talk today about Relate in a few different contexts. And so just very briefly, I'll go over what Relate is. We are a science communication and public engagement organization and what that involves. I'll talk a little bit about our recent free online teach-out, Stand Up for Science, which took place in May. And then I'll also, like the STEM Ambassador Program, I'll go over what we consider our top tips for other groups are. So Relate is a grassroots organization promoting science communication and public engagement among researchers in STEM, and we were founded at the University of Michigan. We provide training opportunities, outlets for public engagement, and resources to facilitate effective science communication and public engagement among researchers of all different stages in the academic hierarchy. Importantly, it's important to note that most of our activities are really focused on trying to help scientists themselves become more effective communicators so that they're better equipped and better prepared to engage in public engagement opportunities. And then the sort of second half of that is that we really make an effort to try and give people an opportunity to put those skills in action. So I mentioned that we were founded by graduate students, and Relate is still run almost exclusively as a volunteer effort, which means that it's a group of postdocs, grad students, and a faculty advisory board that relies on collaborative effort and teamwork to develop our curricula, host training opportunities, and then facilitate these public engagement events. We launched formally after winning the Community Choice Award for the National Science Foundation Innovation and Graduate Education Challenge back in 2013, I believe. And we've been running for about 4.5 years now, and we're about to launch our fourth intensive workshop opportunity here at U of M. We've trained over 100 graduate students in our intensive series, and then we've also trained a number of other, or done shorter trainings to train other groups of people. At this point, having trained about 1,400 students in shorter workshops, and most recently in our recent digital teach out, we reached about 1,600 students and learners around the world. So Relate's fundamental philosophy is to try and break down communication fundamentals, skills like fitting a communication effort to an audience, developing and delivering an effective message, scaffolding a communication effort based on a good and engaging narrative structure, using appropriate language, visual aids, and nonverbal practices. The key component of what makes Relate an interesting and valuable opportunity at the University of Michigan is that we pair these training opportunities very directly with practice. So every student who goes through our intensive workshop series is funneled directly into an opportunity where they can actually put those skills to the test and go and practice public engagement in a real live community setting with real people. We use a science cafe model, although we also partner with organizations including science museums to provide different opportunities and outlets for engagement. One other core tenet that I'll mention, and let's go back around to at the end of the talk, is also the idea that we really practice trying to make all of our trainings really effective, including giving our participants lots of practice opportunities and providing them with lots of feedback. So I'm going to sort of leave it at that for the moment, but I'll say that I'm happy to answer questions about our philosophy, our model, how we got started, anything along those lines, depending on people's interest. So now I was asked specifically to talk a little bit about our Teach Out, which is a free online learning event hosted on a massive online open source platform, edX, which means that it's actually still available in an archived form for anyone who wants to go through it. Stand Up for Science, Practical Approaches to Discussing Science That Matters, is a nonlinear, choose-your-own-adventure learning experience. Importantly, it's not a mini MOOC, where the user defines his or her learning goals and level of engagement. There are 4 different parts to Stand Up for Science, and this addresses the choose-your-own-adventure goal. You can sort of pick through any of these as you're interested in. The first part is really the learning goal is to try and give people an opportunity to learn. Participants can explore different motivations and audiences for public engagement by watching videos and reading interviews with a series of expert speakers in 3 different domains that we've broadly classified as different audiences and outlets for public engagement. These broad categories include policy and advocacy, media and education, and outreach. The second opportunity is to practice, and that's the one that I have highlighted here on the screen. Participants can go through essentially a very small version of Relate's core pedagogy on audience messaging and narrative and start to develop a communication effort. The third part is where participants can join discussions focused on a variety of different types of issues in science communication and public engagement, as well as exploring opportunities both locally and globally where they might be able to get involved. And the fourth section, participants can explore resources and connect with other organizations who are active in this space. The idea of the Teach Out was to try and give people an opportunity to learn a little bit, practice a little bit of skills, but then stimulate their thirst to get involved in these types of activities. There are a few key benefits of using an online platform like edX to do this type of work. You reach a much, much larger group of people. So in a weekend, we reached 1,600 people, which is roughly the same as what it took for us to reach in almost 5 years of working at a grassroots local level. And you can provide sort of a short, intense burst opportunity to give people exposure, even if it's more limited exposure, to opportunities to do science communication and public engagement. And again, the goal is to whet people's appetite so that they do more. But there are also a couple of drawbacks to this type of model, including that you have to prep all of the content in advance and that it's relatively inflexible after it launches. And bluntly, it requires a very large time commitment to develop, film, edit, and produce all of the content and then post it into the platform. The last little bit that I want to talk about before I hand over the mic is the major challenges and tips that we have, or that we've experienced as an organization that I think are probably pretty universal to other organizations, including others like Public Communication for Researchers and Science in the News, other grad student-driven organizations. The first major challenge, far and away, is time. All of our participants and all of the members of our team are really working on a volunteer basis, which means that everyone's employed in a different context and that there are always different priorities that people need to try and make time to satisfy. And I think the sort of second most major challenge is that when you develop as a grassroots organization, it's a fairly major barrier to try and overcome a major barrier to overcome is to try and become institutionally supported. It's relatively easy to get small pots of money, especially when you have a goal that a lot of people support, like science communication, but the transition to having protected time, especially when you haven't worked necessarily within the bounds and structures of a university context because you're a grassroots organization, means that that transition can sometimes be very challenging. And I think the third is a major one is mission creep. There are lots of people who want to draw on things like training opportunities, but for slightly different ends. And so you have to be thoughtful and careful about where you devote your time, especially since you are working in a volunteer effort, to make sure that you stay focused on what you believe the core mission is. That said, even though I've just sort of lamented time and that kind of thing is a limited resource, the best thing that I can tell people who are interested in building similar grassroots-style organizations is to say yes. To say yes to meetings with everyone, say yes to every opportunity to present and every opportunity to get feedback. And then, moreover, to use that feedback to really try and improve what you're doing. I also strongly advocate to build and maintain the network. When you're a volunteer outfit, the network is absolutely everything, so always ask for recommendations and connections, always follow up, always respect people's time and limitations to help. And recognize that not everyone's going to be an ally and that that's okay. There are lots of people who are. So I want to end with just our last few thoughts, which are our tenets of best practice. So when you're teaching these types of skills, we tend to teach actively and collaboratively and respect all different kinds of expertise. We don't pretend to know absolutely everything, and they're active practitioners in our room every time we take the floor. And so we always try to respect that. Oh my goodness. I lost, unfortunately, thank you. One of those other presenters could advance for me, that would be great. Make sure that practice is really central and that all of the activities are anchored, because ideally you want to have a big project that people can practice their communication skills as they develop them. And finally, provide lots of opportunities to give and receive feedback and constructive criticism. So with that, I would like to hand the presentation time back to Adriana. You can find our contact information at our website, which I believe is one of the links. Thank you so much. There we go. You can see our contact information there. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and visit our website at learntorelate.org. Thanks so much, and I'll hand it back to Adriana now.
Thank you so much, Elyse. So last but not least, we have Dan Pomeroy, who is the Managing Director and Senior Policy Advisor of the International Policy Lab at MIT. And he will tell us about how to engage faculty in public policy and also inform them about strategies that they may use themselves for this type of engagement.
Sorry, I forgot to take myself off mute. Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction and appreciate being invited. As was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about institutional support for engagement in public policy in academia. And there seems to be a slide missing here. Actually, there's a couple slides missing here. Sorry about that. So we'll just look at this one for now. So I run a program at MIT called the International Policy Lab, which is a service for faculty who want to engage in public policy based on their research. Our stated mission is to enhance the impact of MIT research on public policy. The motivation for this program comes from the fact that there is not a lot of academic incentive to engage in public policy. Oftentimes it's viewed as a distraction from more important work like the research faculty are doing. And so if we could lower the bar for entry into engaging in public policy, we could therefore get more faculty to engage, which is important as our public policies become increasingly technical. So that being said, there are 4 main barriers that the program attempts to overcome that I think from my experience, are the 4 biggest barriers to academic engagement in public policy. First is identifying what is policy-relevant research. So academia produces an entire mountain of peer-reviewed research all the time, much of which is not actually useful for policymakers. However, some of it is, and it needs to make sure that it finds its way there. Second is understanding the public policy landscape. Many or most faculty probably have really only understood the landscape of their own academic interests and research areas, and therefore when they want to reach out to the policy community, oftentimes don't even know where to begin. It's a whole other world to start to learn about, and I think that barrier alone prevents people from making the first step into that. Next is that there are translational issues. Academia and public policy speak very different languages and very unique languages, and so oftentimes the way that each communicates does not line up, and yeah, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. The last is time. As was mentioned previously, there's not a lot of incentive to do this kind of work, and so but it does take time to do policy outreach. It's not something that you can just incorporate into your everyday work. It's something that you have to add on top of it. So in order to address those 4 challenges, I think that's where this kicks off. Okay, we have 4 solutions that I'm going to go over. So first, to address the problem of identifying policy-relevant research on campus, we have developed a call for proposals process. In our first year, we purposefully selected some faculty to work with, but one of the key takeaways from that is just because somebody is doing policy-relevant research does not mean that they necessarily have a strong desire to engage in public policy, so you need to find the overlap between what is policy-relevant and faculty who actually have the time to do that. Oh, I just realized my webcam was not actually on. Hi, guys. So to do that, we have a call for proposals process. This is a diagram that goes into a lot of detail about how that works, but I just wanted to point out a couple sort of key points in that. First off, all of our proposals go through a peer review process, which I think is really important to ensure that the science that the faculty members want to do outreach on is actually well established and maybe not just like a newly developing field. And then in addition to that, we have a conversation with everybody who applies because oftentimes, like I said, the faculty don't even know exactly where to begin, and so their proposals are often not very concrete, and so we sit down and have a brief conversation to really figure out what policy engagement would look like on their project before we then have a selection committee decide which projects to support. And so through that process, by advertising the call for proposals broadly, you can identify what is policy relevant on campus and who has an appetite for doing engagement, which overcomes the first barrier. The next is understanding the first step, the policy landscape. So when we accept faculty into the program, we sit them down and basically have a mentoring session where they meet with myself, who's worked in policy in DC for a while, and a senior faculty member who has some policy outreach experience. And we have a conversation where we really refine what are the policy implications of your research and work to identify the policy ecosystem and all the different players that they could possibly reach out to. Then we define what they want their outreach goals to be, and then based on those goals, we work backwards to create a concrete plan for what we will do over the course of the next year that will move them towards their goals. And then finally, we use these impact plans to manage by expectations. So it's really hard to define policy impact because there are so many things that go into it. So what we do is just define success of our projects based on whether or not we achieved what we set out to do. To deal with the translational issues, we also provide coaching and training. So we run an annual communications training where we bring in an outside organization called Compass, which some of you probably have heard of. And they actually do a full day-long training for faculty specifically on communicating with public policy audiences. which we've done one so far. Our program's only a couple of years old, and it was very well received, so we're doing it again this year. Beyond that, we do individual coaching and training with faculty. So for example, we help convert academic talks into public policy talks, or help edit or revise policy documents, help them write policy memos, all that sort of stuff. Oftentimes this involves, faculty making a first pass at it, and then us rewriting or revising it to make it more sort of in the language of policymakers. And then the last barrier, time. We really try to minimize the faculty time as much as possible, and basically do as much for them as we can, so that way, ideally, they just come in and meet with the right people at the right time, explain their research and the relevance to the policy, and then go back to doing their research. We also provide modest funding to help them travel to meet with the appropriate people, which saves them the time of finding that through foundations or figuring out how to carve it out of other research projects. So with that said, I wanted to give one concrete example so people can sort of wrap their heads around how this works. So for instance, we have a faculty member in mechanical engineering who's a physical oceanographer, and he wrote a proposal that more or less said, I'm working on physical oceanography. I know it's relevant to this topic of deep sea mining, and there's an organization, the International Seabed Authority, that is currently developing regulations for deep sea mining. What do I do about that? So we did a few things for him. First off, started by mapping out the public policy community. I went down to DC and met with the U.S. State Department representative who leads a delegation to the International Seabed Authority, got the lay of the land in terms of different organizations involved, different countries' perspectives, all that sort of stuff, and fed that back to the faculty member. We sent him to a couple different conferences so he could get the lay of the land and understand the types of issues that people were grappling with. And then more recently, we applied for observer status to the International Seabed Authority on his behalf, which was granted actually a couple weeks ago at the annual meeting of the International Seabed Authority. So now he can actually go down and present his work to them. And from there, we are actually, this spring, we're going to put together a workshop here at MIT that brings together academics who do research that would be relevant to deep sea mining, along with all the policy players that we've met so far, to get them to start talking and try and build a policy-oriented research community here at MIT that can address all the issues that are going to arise as the International Seabed Authority works to develop the regulations that oversee deep sea mining. So this is one tangible example. We have something like 30 projects right now, so they go across a wide range of different types of involvement, but this I thought would be a good one to explain the more involved projects. So a couple key ingredients for success. So I guess my point of giving this presentation is, faculty on the line who are thinking about, doing policy outreach, to try to get them to think about how the university that they're at could support this more broadly. I think the first key ingredient is just to have a core group of experienced faculty who are willing to provide advice. The mentoring process that we put the faculty through, where we help them think through, like, what does policy outreach mean, is probably the most valuable part of what we do. In addition, I put that as number one because that can be done with no funding. You just need to get the people together to do it. The next most helpful thing for faculty is to have staff time to make the policy connection. So my position, people find very helpful. The third point is the funding, but we've actually had people in our call for proposals apply for our help without asking for any funding, even though they could, because they found the staff services more useful than the money itself. And then third is funding always helps to do things like put on these conferences or buy flights to go meet with the appropriate people. So the last thing I wanted to show is some similar programs to try and give you a sense that I think this is the way academic institutes are starting to think, and I wanted to present this as a model for policy engagement to hopefully encourage more people to think that way. So first off, Stanford has a program called the International Policy Implementation Lab, which beyond being just one word away from our program is very similar in its mission. And they try to support international impact-oriented research and long-term engagement with applied policy implementation. I talked to the staff of their program. There are some slight differences. They provide funding for policy outreach, but they do not have the staff time to provide staff services like communications training or outreach or anything like that. They just have an annual call for proposals that tries to support faculty outreach to the policy community. So I suppose if you just have money and no staff, that's also a possible first step. Beyond that, the Harvard Belfer Center recently announced that there will be a similar sort of thing, gifts to support research initiatives and policy engagement by faculty members. It's very similar to what Stanford is doing in terms of providing some funding to make that outreach easier. The third example I have here is a Harvard Environmental Law program. I think they already hired for this position, so sorry if anybody got excited about a possible job opportunity, but they were hiring a communications and outreach manager to increase the program's visibility in the policy community and maximize the impact of staff and faculty research, which is nearly the same as our mission statement of maximizing the impact of MIT research. So it sounds very similar to what I'm doing, but so that's just the staff part, and that's just in their environmental law program. The fourth example is the Scholar Strategy Network, which is an organization that actually works with faculty at any university to help them do policy outreach. They so far seem to have been focused on the social sciences, although I know that they're trying to build up policy outreach for other sciences. A fifth example that's not actually here yet, but I'm hoping will be soon, is the Australian National University recently had a consultant who contacted me to learn about our program, and it seems, based on that conversation, that they're trying to start something very similar. So with that, I'm just trying to motivate the idea that this is the way I think some universities are starting to think, providing services for faculty who want to do policy outreach in the same way that they would provide services for connecting faculty to foundations or, other types of things, and wanted to encourage any faculty on the line or people at universities to think about either pushing their university to go in that direction or thinking about how they could set up a program like this themselves. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Dan, for describing the initiatives at MIT as well as others. So I think now we'll turn it over to Justin for the poll question.
Hello, how's everybody doing? My name is Justin Quasso with the Science Network, and really quick, what I want to do is quickly show you some examples of things that are going on in UCS over the next month and get your interest on if you would like to be involved with this. So the first thing we have is that September will be our Early Career Scientist Month. We wanted to amplify inspiring science advocates, share advocacy resources, highlight the work of later career scientists as inspiration, and encourage the dialogue between early career scientists about their advocacy experiences. We'll have a full slate of activities including storytelling, elected official outreach, and plenty of Twitter activities. So let us know in the upcoming poll whether you'd be interested in learning more about activities during this month. In addition, we also are excited to announce a new grant program for science advocates, the Science for Public Good Fund. So Science Network members can apply for the fund for financial support up to $1,000. And these funded projects will be related to defending federal scientists against attacks or state works with clear connections to federal policy. So the deadline for this is tomorrow, so you definitely want to click the links below to find out more about this opportunity. Today is also the last day to write to your senators about the nomination of Samuel Clovis. Clovis, who is a conservative talk radio host, who is a Trump campaign co-chair and also a climate change denier with no training in science, is currently up for the chief scientist role in the USDA. So below there's a link where you can click for you to easily view and send your local senators a form letter with edits opposing his nomination. We also have for you to join up the ever-growing number of experts that are in our Watchdogging for Science program. So basically, this group helps expose and confront efforts to sideline science by stopping anti-science legislative efforts, exposing efforts to censor or manipulate federal scientists in their work, pushing back against budget cuts, and also debunking misinformation by engaging directly with your local representatives. So if you're interested in joining this group, let us know. Also, there's a link below that leads to that. And finally, what we want you to do is to mark your calendar for our upcoming social media campaign, which is #FunUSAScience on Twitter, on Tuesday, September the 5th. So this is a joint effort by 500 women scientists, Rise Stronger, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and engaging scientists and engineers in policy to engage the broader public as well as legislators and share the value of science in society. So as I said, use the #FunScience with a brief description calling out for more important research in our country. And for sample tweets and ideas about creative ways to share your science, check the Twitter handle at the link below, FunUSAScience.info. So I know I went through a lot of things, and what I want to do right now is open up this poll question right here, just for if there are any of these opportunities that you'd like to know more about or like for us to send you some more information about, including the 3 organizations that were just featured on the webinar right now. Take a time to go through this poll and tell us what you'd like for us to send you more information about. The last thing that I didn't mention on there is that our October webinar will be about mentorship. So we want to get people who want to mentor young scientists to be involved with this and to hear about what are some of the things you should provide for young scientists wanting to go in science policy. So I'm going to give you guys about another minute or so to just pick as many of these issues, these topics as you want, and within a week after this webinar, we'll send this directly to you. So we'll give you about 30 more seconds, and then we'll go on to the question and answer portion. All right, we'll give you about 15 more seconds to finish your answers. About 5 more seconds. All right, fantastic. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go into our question and answer section. So I also like to introduce Gary McDowell, who will continue on with our question and answer.
Hi everyone, I'm Gary McDowell from Future of Research. Thanks everyone for presenting. Thank you Nalini, Caitlin, Elyse, and Dan for your great talks. Just a reminder that you can submit questions here, I think on the side. And I will start the question session with all the folks. If I can ask you to turn your webcams on, and then we can see all of you. And the first question, I guess, is for Elyse. Could you talk about the assessment for the teach out and the edX?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should preface this by saying that Relate actually is IRB approved to conduct assessments to understand how efficacious or what ways we could improve all of our communication training opportunities. And so we tried to understand a little bit more about what we could do with the teach out in particular, since we can't survey people who did the teach out quite as easily as we can with a lot of our other training participants. So the main things that we used to try and understand the efficacy of the teach out really had to do with clickstream data and asking a couple of key questions embedded in strategic places. And then there was also an opportunity to do a feedback survey at the end. Now these are limited a little bit and are much less robust than a lot of our evaluation opportunities for our communication training workshops, for our more intensive in-person opportunities, because we can't actually assess the effects of the training opportunity or the learning experience on participants' practice or attitudes quite as easily. So I'm happy to sort of go into more detail about that. The short answer, though, is we asked a couple of questions about self-efficacy and how people's practice might change as a result of the teach out, and then we also tried to look a little bit at what kinds of opportunities people engaged in and how that was associated with if they identified as a scientist or if they identified in some other capacity.
Great, thank you. Okay, there's a question here for Dan. Can you share how your efforts and group are supported? Do you have institutional support from MIT? Do scientists pitch in with grant funding? Yeah. Oh, I think you're still muted, Dan.
Sorry about that. I had it muted on my phone and it wouldn't unlock. Okay, so we just finished our pilot phase for the program, which was the first 3 years, and that was supported by basically internal MIT funding. The MIT Center for International Studies put in some money, and the dean of the School of Humanities and the provost all put in some money. But beyond that, we have been able to raise money for individual projects from foundations by writing grants. So some of that policy outreach, a lot of the travel and stuff, I've been able to raise money from foundations for, or some of the conferences. And then beyond that, MIT alumni has provided us a couple of years of funding to keep the project going. And right now we're putting a pitch in to make at least the staff part of it, so my job, internally supported by MIT as a permanent position. So that being said, the budget is not big. And so, because a lot of the travel, well, it's basically the one person's salary plus the travel, which is pretty minimal. The grants we give are up to $10,000, which is usually more than enough to cover their trips to DC, or even, we have projects in South America or Europe or wherever. So that's our current funding situation. The other thing I want to add is that we are exploring the possibility of including the IPL in NSF grants because they have a broader impacts requirement, and trying to see if it could be included as part of some people's research funding. We're still testing that model, though. That's sort of a couple-year-long project.
Great, thanks. All right, a more general question. I'll start with Nalini and Caitlin this time. So how can we appropriately communicate risk and uncertainty, given that the public wants simple answers that science can't usually provide? I think your mic is muted again.
Okay. Can you hear us okay now? All right, so we would suggest finding areas of analogous uncertainty in the fields that are of interest to public groups. So that's a really important piece that STEMAP emphasizes, is finding a connection to a particular public group. So for example, a baseball fan may have lots of statistics available in past games, but may not be able to predict who will win a given game. A hunter may optimize odds of bagging a deer by identifying the best terrain and where the herds have been, but may not make a kill. And so kind of drawing on those comparisons with other public interests.
All right, great, thank you. So another question we have, I would love to hear the speakers address ways to challenge the deficit model and truly engage lay audiences in dialogue and problem solving with science communities. So maybe Elyse, can I start with you on that one?
Sure. So I think that there are a couple of different opportunities to do this. One of the ways that, so the most common way that people get involved in science communication or public engagement is with like a science cafe model, right, where you have somebody going out into a community venue, they give a short talk, they engage in a sort of question and answer session. And I'd argue that that is a degree of engagement, but since the focus of the talk is really driven by the speaker, it's not actually truly bidirectional in the same sense as something like a community-funded and community-based project is. So one of the things that Relate is not directly involved in, but it strongly supports, is that there's a movement associated with Michigan Medicine to set up essentially like a community-based opportunity for suggesting research projects So in other words, there are researchers who can pitch a project to the community, and then the platform is also set up so that the community can pitch projects to the researchers. So I think that that's very much more sort of a bidirectional kind of opportunity where you're actually using the platform for research as an opportunity for community engagement. I think the other thing that is potentially really valuable is a model that's actually sort of more dialogue-based. And unfortunately, this really gets at the sort of science-interested audience that you guys referenced, Nalini and Caitlin. So in this particular kind of example, there are groups like the Natural History Museum at the University of Michigan that host a different type of science cafe series where they will create a theme, so based on usually like some kind of a current event, and then bring in several different kinds of speakers that view that type of theme through different lenses. So for example, for something like climate change, they might bring in a scientist, they might bring in a sociologist, they might bring in somebody in public health, and then really let the conversation be driven by the people who show up for the cafe. So the experts are there to sort of weigh in, but they're not actually defining the terms of the conversation. What I sort of want to extract from those three different types of examples is that I think that the forum and the context and the opportunities that you give for participants in the conversation to define the scope of the conversation is one of the things that really defines whether or not it's a bidirectional engagement-based model versus if it's a deficit model.
Great. You want to pitch in?
Yeah. One of the things that we do with the STEM Ambassador Program is we make sure that, first of all, we try to create the sense of attitude. We try to open the mind of the scientists even before we even start an event. The second thing we do is we place scientists in the venues of the people with whom we're engaging. And one thing that we've also done, the third thing, is to actually draw upon the authorities, the authority documents or authority materials or objects that belong to the community group. So for example, we had a research or a STEM ambassador interested in basically conveying the importance of trees and forests from ecological standpoints. But rather than using ecological research as the argument for that, she read the Bible, read the Quran, and drew out the verses from the religious texts of the faith-based communities to make the argument that, in fact, the documentation that trees are important in these holy scriptures, that the tree of life, the first page of the Bible. And so when you give up and you can give a sermon about this to faith-based groups in their own churches and synagogues, you're not introducing the scientific authorities, but rather you're drawing upon the authorities of the other group itself. And that then opens up dialogue. The audiences realize that the scientist is having an open mind by reading these scriptures, and I think then conversations can more easily flow back and forth between the two groups.
Great. Dan, do you want to pitch in?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. So one is, so we did some work on communicating climate science to audiences that are skeptical audiences, we'll say. And I think one of the big things is, from a policy perspective, lots of times it's better to work backwards from your goal. If your goal is to, address climate change with public policy, you're better off finding policy solutions that your target audience might agree with and talking to them about that, possibly without even talking about climate change at all. Because you could spend, your entire life trying to convince somebody that climate change is real, or you could spend significantly less time convincing them to get on board with the solution based on whatever their interests are. So we did this lots of times by talking about nuclear energy and its role that it can play in climate. And so that's one bit of advice. So think about, if it's a policy question and deficit model problem, think about what is the solution you're actually trying to achieve, and does it matter if you convince them, or does it matter to just get them on board? The other thing is storytelling, which you guys have kind of already talked about. So I've been running some op-ed campaigns where I'm trying to get scientists to think about using storytelling to make their case, and trying to, one of the big things that's come up through that is trying to convey the difference between giving an example and telling a story, and those are not the same thing. So for instance, science argues with statistics, so cancer research has saved X number of thousands of lives, that's the science thing. And most people understand that that's not very useful. So they can give an example like, this breakthrough was really important and these scientists were involved. That's kind of an example. But then like a story, one op-ed that we had somebody write about was how their father passed away from cancer and how research could have prevented that had it been done sooner. So think about story and narrative and people and emotions over even examples, which I think is a good first step. So yeah, that are my thoughts.
Sure. Elyse, do you want to jump in again?
Yeah, thanks. So I want to come back to a point that Nalini made, which is really thinking about the attitude of the speaker. I think that one of the things that scientists, myself included, I'm a neuroscientist, one of the things that scientists have the tendency to fall into is to fall into the role of the teacher. And there is room for that when you're talking about public impeachment, but you have to be careful and thoughtful to try and make sure that you establish a sense of respecting expertise. Everyone is an expert in something. And I think that one of the things that scientists tend to forget, because we're used to being in this sort of venerated position, is that when you don't leave room for listening and for being open and to being a learner as well as a teacher, then you really shut down the opportunity for public engagement as opposed to just teaching. And fundamentally, just teaching is really the crux of the deficit model. So I guess I just sort of wanted to add to that, and I think that that connects really nicely to one of Dan's points, which is trying to really figure out what the goal of the communication effort is.
Great, thank you. All right, there's still time for some more questions if you're looking to submit them. One more question I'll ask of everyone. I think we'll go back to Nalini and Caitlin again. Are there examples for how the work is valued at institutions outside of the service realm?
Yes, definitely. We have found that, of course, service is the natural place where public engagement falls in. But we've come to understand that, in fact, there are many other places within academia where these kinds of activities can be rewarded. One of the ones that we've encountered most recently has been with the Vice President's Office for Research. And this relates actually to something that Dan said, which is that many scientists on our campus, and I think across the country, are struggling to create broader impacts that are meaningful, that are sustainable, that are evaluatable, and address and engage the public in ways that maybe are different from just scientists saying, well, I'll talk to my undergraduates in my class, or I'll go to my Natural History Museum and engage with those visitors. So we have found that many of our STEM ambassadors benefit greatly from being able to write in the kinds of activities that they engage with our program and are able to justify it by making stronger, broader impacts, which in turn increases the probability of funding from agencies like National Science Foundation and NASA. So that link not just to service but also to research, I think, speaks very strongly, at least in an R1 institution like ours.
Yep. Dan, thoughts?
I mean, along the same lines, well, we are sort of testing this model to see if we can help enhance broader impacts. We don't have any data necessarily to support it yet, but hopefully at some point we can make some statements about that. Also, in some sense, I kind of view my program sometimes as being a Band-Aid on the problem of the lack of academic reward for this kind of outreach. Which is, again, goes back to the whole let's lower the bar so that way people can do this without sacrificing so much of their academic career. That being said, there are some departments at MIT that are starting to think about, well, there is a culture of MIT of your research having impact and that being important to your tenure case and that sort of thing. And there are some departments that are starting to consider policy impact as a type of impact that can fulfill that. So I think that's a bit of a cultural change, and I think that can only happen as more, more graduate students who are policy-oriented now, or at least understand the importance of policy outreach or broader, community outreach, start to take over the roles of faculty who have different ideas about that.
Right, Elyse?
Sure. I don't have too much to add because I think that Dan and Nalini really covered it. I do want to amplify Dan's last point, which is I think that there's there's frequently a lot of emphasis on faculty doing this type of work, faculty getting involved in public engagement, faculty testifying to Congress. Okay, that one is probably more appropriate for faculty. But I want to make the case that, as many others have before me, that early career researchers really have a role to play. One of the things that, from my perspective, really important about public engagement for early career researchers is that it doubles as professional development. It doubles as communication training, which makes early career researchers more effective in giving professional talk. It also means that when you're able to translate about and talk about your research and step into your role as an expert, as an early career researcher, that has really important and lasting effects both on your motivation as a student and also on your confidence in sort of stepping into that space as an expert, which again translates back into the sort of professional realm. I think that early career researchers have more time to do this type of work, and so one thing that I would very much like to see, in addition to all of the other cultural shifts that Nalini and Dan referenced, is more embrace of early career researchers as one of the unmet opportunities to really sort of facilitate and push public engagement efforts forward.
Great, thanks. So I think we only really have time for one last question, and this one I'm actually going to bring Justin back in because it's specifically to Union of Concerned Scientists. And the question is, what sort of projects are you looking for in terms of the Science for Good Fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So with these, first of all, I would say, you know, as I talk to this, I will just redirect everyone back down to the link section. The fourth from the bottom, it says Science for Public Good Information. There you'll have all the qualifications and all the, you know, information, the who, what, when, where, and why you'll need for that. But in general, as I said, there any projects that use science in order to kind of help towards a federal political end. So whether that's hosting a public forum, using the money towards that, or there's hosting advocacy training, being able to support work with the community. So whether you need the resources or anything in order to build community partnerships, anything that kind of leads towards some sort of tangible policy outcome, using your science is kind of what we want to see with that. Yeah.
Great. I guess with that, I want to say thank you to all the speakers for your wonderful talks, and thanks to the Union of Concerned Scientists for hosting this great webinar. And thank you all for participating and listening. Thank you.
Okay, you guys are good.